Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. This is going to be a continuation of the Voluntary City series that I've been working on. And in this video, we're going to be looking at that section in the book referring to private governance. And the first chapter is on proprietary communities by Fred Foldvary. So Fred Foldvary is a Georgist or geoist. However, he is also an anarchist. So his beliefs would be along the lines of that people should be able to voluntarily choose to live under a Georgist or geoist regime, but he would not force anybody to do this. However, in reading his chapter, I don't see anything in it that really conflicts with any sort of private property, capitalist property relations. So I don't see any problem with anything that he says. So in this chapter, he spends a lot of time talking about a gentleman named Spencer Heath, who sort of pioneered the idea of communities providing public services, things that would normally be provided by municipal governments, like garbage collection, streets, parks, that sort of thing. So Spencer Heath sort of started this idea many decades ago, talking about these private communities providing these things. And his idea for the implementation of that, or his analysis of things that were going on, was that these goods and services would be provided by location-specific capital goods. So the goods that were required to provide these things, or these goods themselves, such as the streets, were location-specific. And that those locations would be neighborhoods or communities, things of that nature. So what this comes down to is that by tying these things to the location, they're able to generate rents. And these rents are the method by which these goods and services are funded. Now, this idea was continued by his grandson, Spencer Heath McCallum. So Spencer Heath McCallum took the idea that any goods or services that are provided by at the municipal level of government or higher is already provided in some manner by property relations. And these property relations are community associations or proprietary communities. And these things take the form of, when you look, this is the sort of thing that you don't really think about too much when you see them, but when it's pointed out to you, it's, oh, well, yes, that actually is, it makes a lot of sense. I see how that is. So examples of these things are things like hotels, industrial parks, real estate parks, and other sorts of neighborhoods along those lines. So when you look around, also condominiums, that sort of thing. So when you look around, you see this sort of private governance going on a lot, but you don't really think of it so much as real private governance. So Spencer Heath McCallum took the idea of these sorts of proprietary communities where the land and the property comes under single ownership by the association. So people would voluntarily pool these resources together, these location-specific resources, or they might buy into this community, and they would govern this area, and that's how this would be provided. So and again, when you look around, you see these things all over the place. The other thing is, because these things are location specific to the neighborhood, and these goods and services are provided through this single ownership association, what people are purchasing, the customers, so to speak, that may buy into this by moving there or so on and so forth, like moving into a community or renting out a community, a plot of land or something in that particular community. The leadership that provides these goods and services is one of the characteristics by which people are judging whether they want to become a part of it. So that's a very important thing. You have these associations that are providing these goods and services, and people are choosing to either join these communities based in, at least in part, upon the actual leadership itself. Like the governing association is part of the characteristics of the sale, part of like one of the selling points. So that was Spencer Heath McCallum's continuation of his grandfather's work, that of tying these things to location-specific capital that generates rents, which funds these things. Some other examples of these things, these institutions which can provide these services, are civic associations. So a civic association is a voluntary association of people that will provide various public resources and services, and they can take a number of different forms, but the two main ones would be like a residential association, and in this instance it comes down to somebody owns a plot of land, or they own a property within the community, and they also own part of the common area within the community. So you might have a neighborhood, and in the neighborhood you've got houses and plots of land, and maybe they also have some sort of garbage collection set up, and there's also streets and lights and things of that nature, and maybe some common playground areas, things like that, maybe a park or something that pretty much everybody has common access to that lives in the community. So in the residential association, all of those things would be partly owned by each individual landowner within the community. There are also other associations like a homeowner association. This is the other main one, and this one differs in that, say, a person would they own the plot of land, and they own their house, but they don't actually own any of the common areas. And instead what happens is the civic association, or in this case specifically the homeowner association, they are the ones that actually own the common areas, and the association manages the common areas at the behest of the landowners. So these things are typically governed by a particular voluntary association constitution that outlines the scope and authority that is being granted to these particular civic associations. However, unlike the government, which does not rest on voluntary consent, these actually do rest on the voluntary consent of the people involved. So that's another very important distinction. But yeah, these are two more examples of particular associations that provide these services. So where does this all lead? Where is this going to? Well, the important thing about these associations is that they serve as a means to solve the public goods dilemma. So the idea behind the public goods dilemma is that so there are certain things that may be of benefit to a large number of people, but coordinating action among that large group of people is very costly, and maybe it's hard to convince a whole lot of people to to get on board and provide resources for these things. So like maybe a large road that it would be good for 1,000 people to contribute to, and it would be beneficial to them all, but it's difficult to coordinate the action of that 1,000 people to get them to actually go along with it. So these associations, they serve to solve this problem because, as was mentioned prior to this, they tie these goods to the location, and the capital, which is the goods that are used to produce the things in question, such as maybe streets, are tied to these particular locations, and then people have to join the community in order to benefit from them. So that's one way that this serves to help mitigate the public goods dilemma. The other one is because the issue at its heart is one of how do you coordinate the action of a large group of people, and it becomes very costly when you're trying to get a whole bunch of people to make a decision, like make the same decision. So if you want to build a road and you need 1,000 people to choose to allow that road to be built because maybe it runs up against their property, or to contribute some funds, some resources to have that road built. If you're looking at it from the atomistic owner standpoint, where each individual person is somebody that must be negotiated with, then this becomes very costly. However, this particular analysis ignores the fact that, and this is played out in the real world, that people tend to be, in almost all instances, not atomistic. They don't just live out on their own. They tend to be, in the overwhelming number of cases, parts of communities, and in many instances, probably the overwhelming majority of them, these communities are governed by these civic associations, homeowner associations, etc., etc., etc. So what this means is that you're not dealing with orders of magnitude more individual atomistic property owners. What you have are pre-existing large-scale associations that are already coordinating the actions of large numbers of people. So in order to engage the community, or the large-scale, the wide-scale community, in order to build a large-scale public works project, like maybe a road or a bridge, you don't have to reach out to, say, 100,000 people. Maybe you only have to reach out to 10 communities that are already governed by their own specific civic associations that are already coordinating their actions. So the problem is much, much less difficult by orders of magnitude. And when you look at the historical record, like Spencer Heath McCallum, and obviously Fred Foldberry have done, you see that these communities naturally come into existence and grow and flourish. So when you're looking at the public goods dilemma from the standpoint of atomistic individuals, you're simply ignoring the real world examples that are all around you that would serve to dramatically mitigate this problem. So this was I thought this chapter was very interesting. So I found it very interesting. I learned a lot from it. I appreciate Fred Foldberry's work here. So we'll be moving on to the next chapter. So moving on to the next chapter that covers contractual governments in theory and practice. So, as stated earlier in this video, things like homeowners associations are examples of these sorts of contractual governments. And what these are associations which are governed by agreed upon rules. So everybody voluntarily consents and agrees to the set of rules by which these associations will execute their actions, and they are also executed by specific officials within the associations. Now, the important thing that these associations offer relative to, say, municipal governments is they are in some ways in competition and complementary to these municipal governments in a very interesting way. So if you think about it, one of the thing that was pointed out in this chapter is that they're providing the same goods and services that the municipal governments are providing, but the main contrast here is that they are providing a different. The distinguishing factor is not necessarily the good and service in question, but the rules by which these things are created and maintained. So it's not, to look at it as an example, that may clarify this. So let's say there's a road. You've got a municipal government and a homeowners association. They're both providing roads, but where the homeowners association is in competition, the unique thing of the homeowners association is that they are providing different rules by which the production and management of that road is created. So that's the critical thing here to start with. What this chapter is looking at is the rules by which these things are governed by, which again everybody must agree to voluntarily. So continuing on with this analysis of contractual governments, a gentleman by the name of Charles Thibaut did a lot of work developing the theory of intergovernmental competition. So what he looked at was the competition between governments through people moving from one locale to another. So you can you can choose to not be governed by a particular government or municipal government in this instance by moving from one location to another. So that provides some amount of competition, but there's a couple of restraints here. There's a couple of problems. One is that location decisions are costly. So it's hard to move from one place to another. There's a large cost involved there. The other one is that once people move from one location to another, they have very little incentive to participate in the governing process. And there's a whole bunch of literature in the public choice domain that goes over this, the idea of rational ignorance, where people, the cost of informing yourself and participating in the governing process is so great that it completely overwhelms any sort of marginal benefit you might be able to get from it. So that's the main problem with that. So this raises a problem with the local governments. What happens is, because people don't have much of an incentive to participate in the process, this means that the local governments are less responsive and therefore they have less incentive to meet the needs in an actual beneficial manner of their citizens, and that is obviously a very big problem. So it was noted that if the municipal governments were privately owned, then that would be a better situation as far as producing better outcomes. So what sort of advantages would a privately governed community have over, say, the municipal government? So there's two main ones that this chapter talks about. The first one is that the community governing associations are capable of providing these public goods and services at a level of aggregation different from a municipal government. So you look at, say, a municipal government, a city. So the city might provide public services like garbage collection, water, utilities, streets, and so on and so forth. All of these things are managed at the level of the city, and there is no change to that. That's just how it is. The government is created over that, was created over that specific area, and people did not consent to this voluntarily, and it is now there, and that's just the level that these things are provided. But a private contractual government is not beholden to that specific level of aggregation. It can be, they can be small, they can be large. There may be different goods and services that would make sense for them to be provided on a smaller level than the municipal government, but maybe there are other ones that it would make sense for it to be aggregated at the level of the municipal government. And so there's a lot more flexibility as far as that level of aggregation, and that would tend to produce better outcomes. The other one is the private contractual governments would produce a better environment for creating more optimal rules. So this goes back to how people have to voluntarily consent to the rules. And so when these associations are created, they have to attract people to them. So the rules are set up at the beginning of the process. Like you would create a community, and it would be the Constitution would be created by getting the consent of people that are moving there. So the rules are generated up front in a dynamic environment. It's not like these people came up with the rules and then they were forced on everybody. The rules are agreed upon by people in a competitive manner, where you might have communities popping up all over the place and they're in competition with each other, and they're each providing a different set of rules, and the ones that have the set of rules that are most beneficial to people are the ones that people are going to flock to. So that general environment will tend to produce better rule creation outcomes than, say, a municipal government, which does not rely on the competitive process in that way. So that was another very interesting chapter. We'll be continuing, and I probably might be doing some more research on that particular theory that was covered in there. I think there's a lot more interesting stuff there. But anyway, that was that chapter on the private contractual communities. So the next chapter in this section is on privatizing the neighborhood. This chapter notes that in the latter half of the 20th century, many millions of people began living in communities that were governed by these sorts of neighborhood associations. However, it also notes that they join these neighborhoods through new development. So, like, for example, not by moving to it's not like there were a group of properties that already existed and they formed this association. They were formed through the building of the community. Like, say, a developer owns a large plot of land, they subdivide it up into various properties and build homes, and then they sell those lots to people, and the association, which would have the constitution which governs it, is tied to those properties for this new community. So this allows them to help overcome the free rider problem and to help protect the value and character of the communities. And also these things serve to provide goods and services for the people within the community that are normally provided by a municipal government. And this is all very good. However, it does tend to leave people living in existing communities somewhat out of the picture. The cost of coordinating the creation of these associations tends to be a lot higher, so it's a lot harder to create a neighborhood association in an area that doesn't already have one, as opposed to where there isn't an existing neighborhood and a developer comes along and builds a new neighborhood and sells off the plots to it and ties the association and its constitution to those sales. So this leaves a lot of people, millions of people, on the outside looking in as far as benefiting from these associations. However, one of the main points of this chapter is outlining a step-by-step process whereby existing communities can transition to neighborhood associations, privately governed. And that's it's a 5-step process that I will briefly and quickly outline. So this process is a 5-step process. And in brief, the first step is a group of property owners would petition the government saying, yes, we want to have a private association that handles these things. So the step 1, petition the government. Step 2 would be the government validating that this community meets certain criteria, say that it's contiguous, maybe certifying the borders and boundaries of whatever this community might be, and so on and so forth. Step 3 would be an outline of what particular services the association would provide, as well as any public goods, like, say, roads and so on and so forth, that already exist and are managed by the municipal government, would be transferred over to the association, and what other public services that are currently being provided by the municipal government, say like policing, garbage collection, and that sort of thing. Those services being currently provided by the municipal government, step 3 would outline which of those and to what extent they would be taken over by the association, as well as any tax incentives or anything of that nature that the association may receive based on the fact that they are now taking over those properties, the maintenance of those particular goods and properties, and also taking over those services. Then what would happen is step 4, the government would call an election 1 year after the request, and then 5, it would certify that the election passed and that the threshold was met as far as meeting as far as whether this would go forward. So in the book, he says something like, if the voting threshold would be if 75% of the people, of the landowners vote yes, along with, in combination, at least 90% of the land involved would have to be voting yes in order for this transfer to take place. And it's important to note that the purpose of all of this, the purpose of this process would be to move services and other public resources that are currently owned and managed by the government into private hands. So as far as my thinking on this, I like the idea. I think it's a good start. I don't know how keen I am on there not being unanimous consent here, because obviously there seems to me, at least my reading of this, there would be people that would be stuck under this association that never agreed to it. Maybe there's some way of compensating them, but I do like the idea of transferring all of this from the municipal government to private hands. So I think this is an excellent start, and there is I think it could probably use some more work, but if this is like the worst case scenario, this is probably a pretty good way to transfer all of these goods and services from the government into private hands. So in the current scenario, many of these functions of these neighborhood associations are handled at the municipal level through zoning. Things like lot size, property characteristics, and so on and so forth are handled at the municipal level, and it's through these zoning laws. However, private associations have certain advantages over zoning laws that would make it advantageous for these things to be handled by these private associations. The first of which is that private associations can manage things in much more minute detail. They have fewer limitations and restrictions as far as what sort of criteria properties within the community must meet. And ultimately this comes down to people can voluntarily delegate whatever rights and privileges to an association that they so desire. So from the theoretical level, an association could be created to manage pretty much anything you can think of, or have any sort of service or good that you can think of, whereas municipal governments tend to be a lot more restricted in what they're doing. The other thing is, when these things are managed by zoning laws at the municipal level, what ends up happening is that the community, a given community, is subject to governing forces and individuals outside of the community. So there are many people that have a say in things that directly affect that community in some ways very dramatically. They have a say in what happens, and the municipal government will utilize its force and authority to force those decisions, which were made by people outside the community, upon them. And this is very unjustified when you think about it, that these people who are being subject to the whims of people outside the community, who are now utilizing the zoning laws in such a manner that it affects people within the community, and they have no way of preventing this. So these are the two main ways that the zoning laws are an inferior way of handling these things. They would be much better off being handled from a private association, because ultimately what's going to happen is by these things being handled by the municipal government through zoning laws, the community is going to be subject to regulations that it simply does not want, mainly because they're of no benefit. So it's much better to have these things handled through a private association. There are further problems with these things being handled through the municipal government and their zoning laws. One of them is that the sale of zoning is forbidden because it's considered government bribery. So the government does not allow people to pay, or at least theoretically, does not allow people to pay to have certain zoning laws changed and or altered or negated. However, for a private association, the way that it handles these things is that all of these things fall under the category of property rights. So the association could actually sell some of these rights in order to allow entrance fees, to allow entrance into the community that normally would not be possible if it was being managed by municipal government. So let's say there's a company that wants to open up a landfill in the middle of a neighborhood. And let's say that the zoning laws say, no, you can't have a landfill here. There's something in the zoning laws that would forbid this from happening. Well, let's say that the homeowners within that association decide, you know what, we'd be okay with there being a landfill, and we think that the added resources, like the added money that this company is willing to pay us for this access right, we would rather have that money and give up that plot of land for the landfill than not have it. So an association would be able to make that deal, would be able to sell that property right to have that landfill there to that company where the zoning laws would prevent it. And the other thing is, continuing along with this, by allowing this to happen, an association would be able to transition the character of a community from one manner to another. So let's say a community is has a very traditional architecture to it, and it has rules that say the houses have to look a certain way. And let's say a company wants to come in and they offer a large sum of money to say, hey, we want to remodel. We want to have the ability to remodel the homes in the style that we specialize in. Well, the association could sell that right and transition the style of the community from its prior condition into a new condition. Now, one of the problems with a municipal government is, as was mentioned earlier, they can be subject to regulations and changes which are detrimental through the actions of people outside the community. So the general tendency is for communities to oppose changes in zoning laws. They would rather not have any changes at all, because there's a reasonable chance, probably a good chance, that any changes to the zoning laws will end up being detrimental to the community as a whole, because the decisions are being made by many people outside the community who have little to no incentive to ensure that the needs of that community are necessarily met. They're most likely want to have the zoning laws benefit them personally than this other community. So that leads to the tendency for zoning laws not to change, or it makes it much harder for them to change. However, if the community itself is the one making the decisions, then the decisions to transition from one style of community to another, and again, the characteristics of each style and condition are limitless. It just comes down to whatever particular property rights they want to change or sell off. So these are some more problems with these zoning restrictions, with these things being handled through zoning laws, that having them being handled through a private association would be very beneficial. Some further advantages of private associations handling these things as opposed to them being done at the municipal level through zoning laws is private association. People would benefit just through these things being provided privately, just through more efficient execution of services like garbage collection, policing, so on and so forth. The tendency would be for these services to just in general be managed and handled in a more efficient manner. So that's another way that these private associations would be an advantage. And the main critical thing to remember when talking about the zoning laws and the private associations selling of these property rights is to understand that these zoning laws are exercising property rights in the community. So all of the specific things that the specific goods and services that are provided, as well as the specific criteria and conditions for the properties within that neighborhood, ultimately come down to these are property rights in the neighborhood. And when the government passes zoning laws that handle, that manage these characteristics of the neighborhood and manage what can be built in these particular areas based on whatever the zoning law is, what it is a forced transfer of property rights from the tenants within that community to the government through the enforcement arm of the police network. So when you really, that was really a very nice way of saying it's a act of theft of property rights from the tenants of the community to the government. So theft is, most people, when you ask them, they think theft is pretty bad, but here zoning laws from an analytical level are simply theft of property rights within the community, and those property rights are transferred from the people within that community to the government. So that's not going to tend to produce a good outcome. This chapter also covered some history of zoning analysis and zoning laws. I'm going to sort of skip over some of that. And like I've said in other videos, I don't want to cover everything in this book in minute detail. There's so much wonderful information. I'm just giving a high-level overview of like the main things and things that I may personally find interesting. But I want to give you enough of an overview and description so that you understand why having these things done privately is better, but I definitely think it would be very, very fruitful to actually read the book. So again, there's some more material on zoning laws in this particular chapter. It was a very long chapter, I think about 60 plus pages. Highly recommend you read it. But yeah, that's pretty much this chapter. So in the last chapter in this section, the author decides to consider the possibility of land lease as a better alternative to the more common, much more common scenario of subdivision, subdivided neighborhoods. So in a subdivision, what happens is there are plots of land with homes on them, and these plots of land are owned by different people, and then these people collectively have, say, a homeowners association, and this homeowner association will manage that particular community. So there's no single owner of all of the property. It's owned individually by all the people that live there, and each of them owns their specific piece of it, and there's no single owner of all of them. In a land lease situation, there is a single owner of all of the property. So all of the land owned by one institution. It could be a single person, or it could be a property management company, but it's all owned by the same person, by the same organization. And this organization manages the whole thing. So there's a single owner, single entity that owns it all, as opposed to a subdivision where there are multiple owners, could be many owners. So this chapter makes the case, actually the author is, I mentioned earlier, Spencer Heath McCallum. Spencer Heath McCallum is actually the author of this particular chapter, coincidentally. So he thinks that land lease is maybe not necessarily, he outlines a bunch of advantages that he thinks are apparent, but ultimately the market will decide. But anyway, I will give a really quick outline of what he lists as the potential advantages of land lease associations as opposed to the subdivisions. So first, with land lease, there is an entrepreneurial incentive to gain specific knowledge which would be of benefit to the particular tenants and implement it to their benefit. However, with the voting structure of subdivisions, it tends to be managed more in a reactive as opposed to a proactive manner. Another advantage of a land lease versus subdivision, according to Spencer Heath McCallum, the subdivision is owned by a lot of people, each owning their own specific plot, which means that they may try to advantage their plot versus other people. They may want to create specific changes in the association, the way things are run, so that their plot is advantaged relative to other plots. However, with land lease, there is only one owner, and so that single owner there is harmony of interests because there's only one owner as far as what needs to be done, and this single owner can go about managing all of the property, the community as a whole, to benefit the community as a whole. Some other advantages, according to Spencer Heath McCallum, as leases come up for renewal, that allows changes to be made within the community, structural changes, maybe layout changes, so on and so forth, that sort of thing, as opposed to a subdivision where once the layout is set up, it's very difficult to impossible to actually make any changes. Another thing is land lease is financed through rents, so it's self-sustaining financially. In fact, the owners would certainly want to try to run it at a profit, but the point is that the rents themselves are what is funding everything, as opposed to subdivisions which are run at a loss with fees making up the difference to actually handle the finances. So those are a couple more advantages for potential advantages for a land lease versus a subdivision. Continuing on with some more potential advantages, the rents provide a market feedback mechanism for the land lease model that is not present in the subdivision model. And another issue with subdivisions versus land lease, or another advantage, is in land lease, the lease itself provides a greater level of predictability for the tenant in question, because the lease is negotiated between the tenant and the single owner of the community, and that lease, for as long as that lease is in effect, the tenant can feel very certain that these are the conditions and rules that they must abide by. Whereas in a subdivision, it's possible that these things can be changed over time through the actions of, through the voting action of the association in question. So another advantage is the predictability of the rules and conditions that one must live under. Additionally, the owners of the land lease association, the single owners, have to view the properties as an ongoing operation. They can't just sort of think of it as okay, 6-month thing. So they have to have a longer term view of how to manage the property beneficially. They can't just look at the short term. They have to examine things from a longer term perspective. Also, there is a contrast between the general behavior of subdivision associations and the land lease owner. Subdivision associations tend to be enforcement organizations, whereas a land lease owner would tend to be a service-oriented organization. That's just the nature of the beast, so to speak. The subdivision is dealing with rules that are being enforced upon all of the people there. They're all owners, and so they're all trying to they may end up trying to jockey for position as far as having advantageous rules, and the nature of the association is to enforce those rules. So for an owner, a land lease owner, because they have to they're viewing it as an ongoing operation and they have to run it for profit, they have to make sure that they're able to continue to attract tenants to their property. So they have to look at it as in a much more customer service oriented fashion to make sure that they don't lose tenants over time. Some further compare and contrast between subdivisions and land lease organizations. Subdivisions tend to handle disputes through litigation. These things tend to end up in court in order to be settled between the tenants and the homeowners association. Whereas with a land lease owner and manager, they will try to arbitrate disputes among tenants because they are the single owner. They want things. It makes more sense for them to have harmony between the tenants than for the tenants to end up in court to handle these sorts of disputes. And speaking of harmony, there is also one other issue here that Spencer Heath McCallum brings up, and that is, and this is something I've mentioned earlier, just a little while ago. The landowners in a subdivision are going to try to, they have an incentive to have it, the homeowner association, manage the community to benefit their plot of land. So the reason why this is so is because they want to maximize its value. This is the only financial incentive that they have here. They just have the property value, which they could possibly recoup through sale. So they will end up trying to manage and regulate the behavior of their neighbors, which tends to not make people want to hang out together and have like a sense of community amongst each other. They may not want to associate as much with people that they know are trying to manage their property for the other person's property benefit based on these rules that they're trying to get through the homeowners association. This is just a natural outcome of the fact that each of these people is an owner of a specific plot. So you have a bunch of owners, and they're all trying to maximize the value of their plot of land. And this can create some issues as far as conflicts with regard to how people's behavior is regulated. Whereas with the land lease setup, you have the single owner who is managing with a view of the community as a whole, and that burden is taken off of each of the individual tenants. They don't have that financial incentive. Which sort of puts them at their neighbor's throats. So they can focus on having a nice little community and have community involvement and interaction. It's not to say that in a subdivision people don't have that. It's just that this might create more of an incentive to have that community feeling and atmosphere. So another thing that McCallum brings up is that these subdivisions have been favored by governments for many decades, and also large corporations that develop these large subdivisions and then sell them off. So there's been a lot of government influence, which has led to the overwhelming prevalence of this property configuration. So some points that he makes are that if land lease could become more popular, the competition among the land lease organizations would be beneficial not only for the land lease communities, but also for the subdivision communities. They would probably benefit from having an alternate community structure that they now have to compete with. So ultimately, the land lease the land lease structure would probably benefit everyone, and I think that that's a good reason. I think that rationale is fairly valid. I am now sympathetic to the land lease idea. I don't know whether I necessarily agree with everything Spencer Heath McCallum said, but I think he makes some good points in this chapter, which again is the last chapter in this section that I'll be covering in the video. So yeah, it gave me a lot to think about. These chapters gave me a lot to research further, a lot of things to look into, and yeah, I'm very pleased with how these chapters went. Also, there's only one more chapter left in the book. It is an epilogue chapter, so I'll be doing a video on that, and maybe have some comments not necessarily relating to the book itself, but maybe things inspired by the book. I may throw in. We'll see how it goes. Anyway, this is the end of this video. As always, hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting, and you learned something, and maybe there's some stuff you want to look into now to research further. So anyway, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.